Do you really think that shop truly belongs to you? Mama Zanele slammed her hand onto the table, her voice so cold that the entire room fell silent. This family made you who you are today. Naledi stood frozen, her hands gripping her old handbag tightly. She turned to look at her husband, waiting for him to say something, just one sentence. But Demba couldn't even look her in the eyes. He lowered his head and said quietly, "Just sign the papers, Naledi. Don't make this harder than it needs to be." No one knew that the woman's heart shattered in that exact moment. Naledi didn't sign the papers that day. She simply stood up quietly, picked up her handbag, and walked out of the house filled with heavy sighs and cold stares. But the entire drive from Soweto back to Johannesburg, one question kept spinning inside her mind. When did the family she had sacrificed for over 12 years start looking at her like a stranger? Some people looked at Naledi's life and thought she was lucky. A woman with her own shop at Neighbourgoods Market, loyal customers, and a stable home. But no one saw the years before that. The mornings she sat on freezing sidewalks before sunrise, her hands cracked from sewing scarves while carrying heavy boxes of fabric. While Johannesburg was still covered in early morning fog, Naledi was already awake at 4 in the morning, rushing to catch a taxi to the market. There were days when heavy rain flooded her boxes, yet she still sat there holding her fabrics tightly in both arms, as if she were holding her entire life together. Back then, Demba didn't have a stable job. The security company he worked for shut down after the pandemic, and for months he spent most days sitting quietly at home. Naledi never complained. She paid the electricity bills, the rent, school fees for one of Demba's relatives, and even Mama Zanele's blood pressure medication every month. Whenever Demba sat in silence, ashamed of himself, Naledi would place a hand gently on his shoulder and say, "Family means getting through hard times together." And because of that belief, Naledi stayed silent for far too long. She didn't only support her husband, she also rescued Sibusiso many times after his failed business ventures while he still tried to live like a successful man. One night, creditors showed up at the house, banging loudly on the gate. Mama Zanele cried and begged Naledi to help because she was terrified her son would get into serious trouble. And Naledi used all the money she had saved to restock her shop for the holiday season just to pay off Sibusiso's debts. But the next morning, Sibusiso couldn't even look her in the eyes. The strange thing was, the more Naledi sacrificed, the more uncomfortable her husband's family became around her. At Neighbourgoods Market, people respected her because of the way she treated others. The vegetable sellers called her Sister Naledi. Young women who were new to the market often asked her for advice. Customers kept coming back not only because her fabrics were beautiful, but because Naledi remembered every customer's name, even the colors they liked. In a competitive place like Johannesburg, kindness rarely survives for long, but Naledi held onto it as if it were part of her dignity. And somehow, that was exactly what began changing Demba. He smiled less than before. Every time they walked through the market and people greeted his wife with admiration, he would go quiet for hours. One afternoon, a man joked with him, "Demba, you really married the queen of this market." Everyone laughed warmly except Demba. His face hardened instantly. That night, he barely spoke to his wife. Naledi could feel the distance growing inside their small home. But like many women, she convinced herself that her husband was simply stressed because he still hadn't found stable work. What she didn't realize was this. Some men, when they can no longer become the provider, slowly begin to resent the very woman carrying them. One Sunday afternoon, Naledi stopped by her mother-in-law's house, carrying groceries and new blood pressure medication she had bought for Mama Zanele. The front door was slightly open. Inside, Mama Zanele was speaking with a neighbor. Just as Naledi reached the doorway, she heard her mother-in-law say bitterly, "My son lives in his own house like a visitor, all because his wife is the one making money." Naledi froze completely. The neighbor answered softly, "But Naledi takes care of the whole family." Mama Zanele cut her off immediately. When a woman makes too much money, she forgets her place. Naledi stood outside that doorway for almost a full minute, but it felt as though her entire 12-year marriage had collapsed right in front of her. The most painful part wasn't that they disliked her. The most painful part was realizing she had loved them sincerely for so many years, never imagining they would one day see her as a threat inside her own family. And for the first time, Naledi finally began to understand that some silences in marriage are not peace. Sometimes they are simply the result of a woman becoming so used to enduring pain that she forgets she deserves respect too. If you understand Naledi's pain, comment strong. After that afternoon at her mother-in-law's house, Naledi began feeling that something around her was changing. Not the kind of change that arrives loudly and all at once, but the kind that hides inside strange silences within the same home she had lived in for over 10 years. Demba started keeping his phone with him all day. Conversations between him and Sibusiso would immediately stop whenever she walked into the room. Even Mama Zanele, who used to call Naledi over every weekend to help in the kitchen, now looked at her with cold, distant eyes, as if quietly blaming her for something. But Naledi still tried to believe everything would be okay. She had spent too many years being the one standing in the middle, trying to keep the family from falling apart. Then 1 week later, the real trouble arrived. That night, just as Naledi finished preparing dinner, loud banging echoed from outside the gate. Temba opened the door, and his face immediately lost all color. Two unfamiliar men stood outside wearing dark jackets, their expressions tense and irritated. Sibusiso, who had been sitting on the sofa, jumped up in panic. "How long are you planning to hide from us?" one of the men shouted. Naledi froze in the kitchen the moment she heard them mention death. It turned out that for months, Sibusiso had been borrowing money everywhere after throwing himself into failed business schemes while still trying to appear wealthy in front of his friends. He bought expensive phones, designer clothes, took friends out to bars, all while barely holding onto stable work. Mama Zanele burst into tears immediately. "How far are you people planning to take this?" she shouted. But one of the men answered coldly, "We just want our money." That night, the entire house sank into tension. Naledi was the only one walking around making tea for everyone, as if she were still trying to hold on to the last bit of peace left in that family. But deep inside, she was beginning to feel exhausted, not because of the money, but because she was always the one cleaning up the consequences of everyone else's mistakes. After the two creditors finally left, Mama Zanele pulled Themba into a private room for almost an hour. When he came back out, his face looked heavier than before. Naledi asked softly, "What's wrong?" Demba avoided her eyes. "It's nothing." But from that day on, he started asking strange questions about the shop paperwork. Why do you keep the business registration documents? Whose name is officially on the store? What if we expand the business one day? Naledi didn't suspect anything. She thought her husband was finally taking interest in her work. Deep inside, she even felt happy because after all those years, Demba finally seemed ready to build a future with her. What Naledi didn't know was that every night after she fell asleep, Themba sat in the living room for hours with his mother and younger brother. Mama Zanele kept pressuring him. This family cannot let Sibusiso lose everything. That shop supported all of us for years. Now it's time for it to save your brother. Or do you want people outside laughing at this family because a woman controls all the assets? Demba stayed silent for a very long time. And then he started doing something that deep down he already knew was wrong. One morning, while Naledi was at the market, Themba opened the cabinet drawer and secretly copied all of her business documents. Later, he took them to meet an acquaintance in Johannesburg who handled cheap legal paperwork. The first time he tried signing Naledi's name, his hand shook so badly he had to do it 3 times. But sometimes, a wounded ego can become more dangerous than greed itself. Demba convinced himself that he was only trying to keep the family together. Meanwhile, Naledi had no idea what was happening behind her back. She was quietly preparing a birthday surprise for her husband. She spent the entire afternoon at the market ordering a small cake she knew Themba loved. She even used part of her savings to buy him a watch, even though she herself hadn't been able to afford a new pair of shoes in months. That evening, Naledi came home earlier than expected to decorate the dinner table. But as she walked past the back room, she suddenly heard Sibusiso laughing softly. "After we take over the shop, don't let her come back." Naledi froze instantly. Then Mama Zanele's cold voice followed. "When women start making too much money, sooner or later they begin thinking they're bigger than the family." Naledi stood outside that door, still holding the birthday cake box in her hands. The cake tilted slightly to one side. The white frosting slowly slid down the edge of the box, exactly like the feeling sinking inside her heart at that moment. And for the first time in her marriage, Naledi became afraid of the very people she once called family. Naledi barely slept that entire night. After hearing the conversation behind the closed door, she still quietly carried the birthday cake to the table as if nothing had happened. Demba walked out wearing a calm expression that felt almost frightening. He even smiled when he saw the cake and thanked his wife in front of his mother and younger brother. And somehow, That frightened Naledi more than anything else. Some words are painful, but sometimes it is a person's calmness that makes you realize everything had been planned long before you ever noticed. The next morning, Naledi still woke up at 4 a.m., just like she had done for more than 10 years. Johannesburg had not fully awakened yet. The streets were still cold and covered in light fog as she pushed her small cart toward Neighbourgoods Market. But for some reason, her heart felt strangely uneasy that morning. The moment she arrived, Naledi froze. The lock on the shop had been changed. She stood there for several seconds, thinking maybe she was mistaken. But when she tried her old key, it no longer worked at all. "What's going on, Sister Naledi?" a fruit seller nearby asked softly. Before Naledi could answer, the shop door suddenly opened from inside. Sibusiso stepped out. He was wearing a brand new shirt, holding a cup of coffee with the smug expression of someone who had been waiting for this moment for a very long time. "Oh, you're here already," he said casually. Naledi stared at him, her voice trembling. "Sibusiso, what is happening?" He shrugged. "The family decided that I'll be managing the shop from now on." The entire market slowly fell silent. A few vendors stopped arranging their goods just to watch what was happening. Naledi let out a small laugh from pure shock. "Managing? This is my shop." But before Sibusiso could answer, Mama Zanele appeared behind him. She walked forward slowly, her eyes cold and emotionless. "You need to learn to accept things, Naledi," she said. "This family cannot let a woman make all the decisions forever." Naledi immediately looked around for Themba, and then she saw him standing inside the shop. He avoided her eyes completely. And in that moment, Naledi understood everything was real. None of them planned to explain. None of them believed they had done anything wrong. The most painful part was not losing the shop. It was realizing that the people she loved the most were now looking at her like an outsider. Naledi stepped closer to the door, trying to keep her voice calm. "Themba, at least talk to me." But he only answered quietly, "Please don't make a scene at the market." Those words instantly made Naledi's eyes fill with tears. 12 years of waking up before sunrise. 12 years of paying the rent, the electricity bills, and her mother-in-law's medication. 12 years of carrying the entire family on her shoulders. And now, the thing her husband cared about most was whether she would make a scene. A few employees standing inside the store looked at Naledi with sympathy, but none of them dared step forward. Everyone was afraid of losing their jobs. In Johannesburg, finding stable work was never easy. And sometimes, people stay silent not because they are cruel, but because they are terrified of struggling to survive. Naledi understood that. So she didn't blame them. But her heart still ached when she saw the familiar chair behind the counter, the same chair where she used to sit counting every small profit to support the family, and now Sibusiso was sitting there like the new owner. Mama Zanele looked around the market and deliberately raised her voice. "In the end, women are only outsiders. A family should be led by men." The atmosphere around them became painfully heavy. Some people lowered their heads. Others quietly shook their heads. But no one spoke. Naledi felt her throat tighten. She wanted to stay calm. She truly did. But when she looked up at the store sign carrying the very name she had painted with her own hands years ago, the tears finally fell. She turned her face away quickly. But it was already too late. A young vendor nearby had accidentally recorded the moment on his phone. At first, he only wanted to show his friends what was happening at the market. But by that afternoon, the video had spread all across Johannesburg. People began sharing the image of Naledi crying in front of her own shop, while her husband and brother-in-law stood inside. And then the whispers began. I heard her husband took the shop from her. She supported that entire family. Can people really treat their wives this way? Did her husband really push her out of her own business? But the thing that hurt Naledi the most was not the gossip from strangers. It was the fact that throughout that entire day, Demba never called her once. He never asked where she was, never asked if she had eaten, never tried to explain anything. And for the first time in 12 years of marriage, Naledi realized a heartbreaking truth. Some women do not lose everything in one single. They slowly disappear while trying to hold together a family that no longer wants to hold on to them. After the video spread across Johannesburg, Naledi could barely bring herself to open her phone anymore. Every time the screen lit up, there were more messages from people at the market, distant relatives, even people she hadn't spoken to in years. Some were genuinely concerned. Others were simply curious, wanting to know whether her own husband had really pushed her out of her business. Naledi replied to no one. She quietly packed a few clothes and walked away from the house she once believed she would grow old in. On her first night in the small rented room in Soweto, Naledi sat by the window for hours. Outside, minibus taxis passed constantly. Music echoed from the restaurant down the street, mixed with laughter and conversation from strangers. Johannesburg was as alive and noisy as ever. Only her life seemed to have stopped moving. Sometimes, Naledi wondered whether she should take everything to court. Many people told her she should, but then she remembered the Demba from the early years of their marriage, the man who once stood in the rain waiting for her to finish at the market just so he could walk her home. She didn't want everything to end in bitterness. But sometimes, a woman's kindness makes people believe she will tolerate anything forever. 3 days later, Thandiwe came to visit Naledi's small rented room. The moment she stepped inside, she looked around the tiny space and sighed softly. You've spent too many years living for other people. Naledi only gave a sad smile. She had never imagined that one day, at nearly 40 years old, she would have to start over with a few bags of clothes and an almost empty bank account. Thandiwe placed an old phone on the table. Use this, she said. Your old customers are looking for you. Naledi looked surprised. Looking for me? People bought from you because of who you are, Naledi, not because of that shop. Those words left Naledi silent for a very long time. For years, she believed she was just an ordinary woman trying to survive. But after losing everything, she finally realized that what kept customers loyal was never only the fabrics or the prices. It was the way she treated people. The next day, Fandiwe helped Naledi live stream a few scarves and handmade items she still had left. At first, Naledi felt awkward. She wasn't used to speaking in front of a phone camera. But slowly, familiar customers began appearing in the comments. Sister Naledi, I finally found you. I still want to buy from you. When are you coming back to the market? Naledi read each message while her eyes filled with tears. Meanwhile, at Neighbourgoods Market, things began changing much faster than Sibusiso expected. He turned the shop into more of a place to show off than an actual business. Loud music played all day. Friends gathered around the storefront constantly. Sibusiso started importing cheap fabrics simply because the profits were higher, even though he knew Naledi's old customers were extremely particular about quality. The employees who once worked happily under Naledi became increasingly tense. The atmosphere inside the shop no longer felt the same. Naledi's soft laughter every morning was gone. Nobody greeted customers warmly anymore. No one remembered their names or asked about their families. One afternoon, an older woman walked into the shop and asked, "Where is Naledi?" Sibusiso answered shortly, "She doesn't work here anymore." The woman touched one of the fabrics and shook her head. "This isn't the kind of material Naledi used to sell." Sibusiso immediately lost patience. "If you're not buying anything, then stop wasting time." The entire shop went silent. The woman stared at him for several seconds before saying slowly, "That's exactly why you'll never be able to keep this place." Rumors quickly spread throughout the market that the Mokoena shop had completely changed after Naledi left. Some loyal customers quietly found Naledi's new online account and began ordering directly from her. And then the thing Sibusiso feared most finally happened. A large restaurant in Johannesburg, one of Naledi's longtime clients, decided to stop doing business with the shop. Right in the middle of the crowded market, the restaurant manager spoke openly. "We worked with Naledi because she kept her word. We no longer trust the way this business is being run." Sibusiso's face turned red instantly. He tried to argue back. "The shop is still the same shop." But the man simply shook his head. "No. A shop is not just a sign above the door." Then he looked around and said loudly enough for everyone nearby to hear, "It belongs to the person who built it." The market suddenly fell into an unusual silence. And for the first time since taking over the store, Sibusiso began to feel afraid because he was finally realizing something very simple. Some things people think they can claim with paperwork were never truly theirs to begin with. 6 months after Naledi left the shop, Neighbourgoods Market no longer looked at the Mokoena family the same way. Back then, Naledi's store used to be the first one with lights on every morning. Loyal customers waited outside because they trusted her promise of quality. But now, the shop opened late most days. Employees kept changing. The fabric shelves that were once neatly organized had become messy and half empty. Worst of all, the loyal customers had almost completely disappeared. At first, Sibusiso still acted confident. He constantly bragged to his friends that he was expanding the business. He even replaced the shop sign with a bigger one to prove he was now the real owner. But as time passed, the empty spaces inside the store became more noticeable than the customers. Some mornings, only a few people walked in before quickly leaving again. The employees began worrying because their salaries were delayed for weeks at a time. A few quietly quit. Those who stayed no longer cared the way they once had. Themba watched everything happen while a heavy feeling slowly grew inside him. For the first time in months, he started remembering the mornings Naledi stood behind the counter with her small notebook, carefully recording every fabric order. Back then, the shop had never lacked customers. No one had ever come into the market demanding money in front of everyone. But now things were different. One hot afternoon in Johannesburg, while Sibusiso sat behind the counter, scrolling through his phone, two men walked straight into the shop. "We came for our money." The atmosphere instantly became tense. Sibusiso jumped to his feet, trying to pull them outside to speak privately. But one of the men said loudly and coldly, "It's been 3 months. Did you really think we would keep waiting?" Several customers turned to look. The employees lowered their heads nervously. Demba stepped out from the storage room, his face turning pale when he realized his younger brother had continued borrowing money behind everyone's backs. After the two men finally left, Demba pulled Sibusiso into the corner of the shop. "How many more things are you hiding from me?" Sibusiso answered irritably. "I just need more time." "More time?" Demba almost laughed bitterly. "You're destroying everything." But Sibusiso still refused to admit he was wrong. He always had another excuse for every failure. When customers stopped coming, he blamed the economy. When employees quit, he claimed they were disloyal. When sales dropped, he said customers were too demanding. There was only one thing he never admitted. He simply didn't know how to protect something another person had spent a lifetime building. Meanwhile, Naledi's small online business slowly became more stable. Old customers quietly kept returning to her. Some even recommended her to friends because they still remembered how trustworthy she had always been. One evening, Thandiwe handed Naledi her phone to show her a message from a long-time customer. "Without Naledi, that shop is no longer a place we trust." Naledi stayed silent for a long time after reading it. She wasn't happy watching them fail. After all, that place had once held more than 10 years of her life. But sometimes, life has its own way of being fair. When people use greed to take something that belongs to someone else, they often fail to understand the true value of what they stole. Then, finally came the day that shocked all of Neighbourgoods Market. That morning, the market was crowded with weekend shoppers. The walkways were packed with buyers and vendors. Sibusiso was pretending everything was normal when a delivery truck stopped directly in front of the store. An older man stepped out. It was Mr. Dlamini, the large fabric supplier who had worked with Naledi for many years. His face was filled with anger. Without greeting anyone, he walked straight into the shop and slammed a stack of papers onto the counter. "How much longer were you planning to avoid me?" The entire store went silent. Sibusiso immediately tried pulling him outside. "Let's talk privately." But Mr. Dlamini pushed his hand away. Privately? He shouted. You took my fabric shipments and disappeared for almost 2 months. And now you want privacy. People nearby immediately stopped to watch. More and more phones were raised to record the scene. Sibu Siso forced an awkward smile. It's just a misunderstanding. But Mr. Dlamini had lost all patience. I worked with Naledi for more than 10 years and never experienced anything like this, he shouted across the market. She never owed me money for even one day. But you keep taking goods and breaking promises. The atmosphere around them felt frozen. Several long-time customers shook their heads in disappointment. Demba stood behind them, his face completely pale. And for the first time, he could no longer lie to himself that things would somehow get better. Within hours, the video of Mr. Dlamini publicly demanding payment spread across Johannesburg faster than any explanation ever could. The reputation of the store completely collapsed. Suppliers stopped cooperating. Customers disappeared. Employees quit. 6 months after forcing Naledi out of the business she built with her own hands, the Mokoena family went bankrupt. And the most painful part was this. Only after losing everything did Demba finally realize that the person who had truly held the entire family together had never been him or his younger brother. It had always been the woman they underestimated for far too long. 3 months after the Mokoena family's shop closed down, Naledi returned to something she once believed she no longer had the strength to do. Start over again. There was no large sign. No beautiful storefront in the middle of a crowded market. Just a small shop sitting on a quiet corner near Soweto with a few old wooden fabric shelves, a worn-out fan that had been used for years, and a sewing table that Thandiwe helped her buy from a liquidation store. But on the very first morning of opening, Naledi cried, not because she was sad, but because the very first customer to walk through the door was an elderly woman who had bought scarves from her for years at Neighbourgoods Market. The woman set down her shopping bag and smiled warmly. I knew you would stand up again. Naledi couldn't even speak. Just a few hours later, more familiar faces began appearing. Some people took taxis for over an hour just to find her new shop. Others brought friends along with them. A few loyal customers even shared Naledi's new address across social media themselves. No one talked much about the past anymore. But the way they came back was enough for Naledi to understand that genuine kindness never truly disappears. Sometimes, it simply needs time to return to the place where it belongs. Little by little, the small shop became busier than Naledi ever expected. Not because she sold things cheaper than others, but because customers felt respected the moment they walked inside. Naledi still remembered everyone's names. She still patiently adjusted scarf edges for older customers. She still made free hot tea for people who had to wait a long time. Some things may seem small, but those are often the very things that keep a business alive for years. One afternoon, while Naledi was arranging fabrics on the shelves, a young woman walked into the shop and stood awkwardly for several moments before finally speaking. Sister Naledi, I saw your video a while ago. Naledi paused slightly. The young woman continued softly. At that time, I was completely dependent on my husband too. I thought women like us would have to live that way forever. Her voice began trembling. But watching you start over again made me want to try earning my own money too. That day, Naledi sat and talked with the young woman for almost 2 hours. And slowly, more women began coming to the shop. Some wanted to learn online selling. Some wanted to learn how to sew handmade scarves. Some simply needed a place where they could sit down and be heard without being judged. Naledi wasn't rich, but for the first time in her life, she felt her life had more meaning than all the years she spent making money before. The strangest part was this. The same people who once mocked her had started looking at her differently now. In Johannesburg, news travels faster than the wind. People began telling each other that Naledi had rebuilt herself without dragging anyone else down with her. She never went online to insult her former husband. She never tried to humiliate the Mokoena family further. Even when many people encouraged her to take legal action, Naledi still chose silence. Not because she was weak, but because she understood something very simple. Some battles won through peace are far more powerful than battles won through hatred. One rainy evening in Johannesburg, Naledi was preparing to close the shop when she noticed a figure standing beneath the awning across the street. It was Thamba. He looked far thinner than before. His old clothes were soaked by the rain. For a few seconds, Naledi could barely recognize the man she had once spent her entire youth loving. Demba slowly walked toward her. "I just want to talk for a little while." Without saying anything, Naledi quietly opened the door so he could step inside out of the rain. The small shop became so silent that only the sound of rain hitting the metal roof could be heard. Demba looked around the store for a long time. Then he said quietly, "You really did it." Naledi didn't answer. After a while, Demba lowered his head. After the shop collapsed, nothing stayed the same. His voice sounded exhausted. "My mother has gotten sicker. Sibusiso left to stay somewhere else. The whole family argues all the time now." Then he looked up at Naledi, his eyes red with emotion. "I just wanted the family to have peace." Naledi stared at the man standing in front of her for a long time. There was once a time when seeing Demba sad would immediately make her blame herself. There was once a time when she would silently accept pain just to stop the family from falling apart. But now, she only felt calm, completely calm. Finally, Naledi spoke softly. "No, you only wanted me to stay silent." Temba froze. Outside, the heavy rain continued pouring down. Naledi kept looking at him, her voice gentle but clear. "Peace does not mean one person has to suffer so everyone else can stay comfortable." Those words made Themba lower his head in shame. Perhaps for the first time in his life, he truly understood that what he lost was not just a shop. It was the woman who had quietly held the entire family together for so many years. But some realizations arrive far too late. Demba left not long afterward. Naledi stood there, watching the rain outside the shop for a little while longer before slowly turning off the lights. There were no more tears, no more bitterness. Only a woman who had finally learned how to choose herself after spending too many years living for everyone else. And in Johannesburg, people no longer remembered Naledi as the woman who lost her shop. They remembered her as the woman who stood back up in the very place where she had once been hurt the most. There are women who do not walk away because they stopped loving. They walk away when they finally understand that love should never make someone disappear from their own life. It took Naledi many years to learn that lesson. She once believed sacrifice was the way to keep a family peaceful. She believed that if she just tried a little harder, stayed silent a little longer, then everything would eventually get better. But sometimes, life teaches people through painful truths that if a family can only survive through one person's silence and suffering, then it was never truly a family at all. Naledi did not seek revenge on Demba. She never tried to humiliate Mama Zanele in front of the community. She wasn't even happy when people talked about the old shop going bankrupt, because after everything, she understood that bitterness cannot heal a heart that has already been deeply wounded. Some of the greatest victories in life are not watching other people fail. They are being able to keep your kindness even after being treated unfairly. Little by little, Naledi's small shop became a place many women came to visit, not only to buy scarves or handmade crafts. They came to hear another woman tell them, "You do not have to lose yourself just to be loved." And perhaps that became the most valuable thing Naledi built after all her losses. In Johannesburg, people no longer remembered her as the woman who once stood crying in front of the shop taken from her. They remembered Naledi as the woman who stood back up with her own hands. A woman who was not richer than everyone else, but far stronger than she used to be. Because in the end, she finally understood that a woman's worth is not measured by how much she sacrifices for others, but by whether she has the courage to protect her own dignity. And sometimes, the most beautiful thing a woman can do for herself is not revenge. It is choosing to move forward and never again allowing anyone to make her forget that she deserves respect. If you also believe that a woman should not spend her entire life simply enduring pain, comment respect and tell us where you are watching this story from. Wishing you strength, peace, and the courage to never lose your own worth.